Next, a look at U.S. diplomatic relations with Cuba in a panel that included the former head of the U.S. interest section in Havana and an activist who participated in the Bay of Pigs invasion. They met in Fort Lauderdale to discuss U.S.-Cuba relations. This is an hour and 10 minutes.
Thanks, Calvin. I'm happy to be here, and I'm proud of the panel that you're about to hear from, especially starting with our moderator. Tim Padgett, perhaps you know his voice, you might know his name. He works for WLRN Radio in Miami and is the Americas editor. He has covered Latin America for 25 years, both with Newsweek and with Time magazine. He has been to Cuba at least 20 times over the course of his career. He is the kind of person you want asking questions. I've encouraged him to contribute his observations as we have today's conversation. And with that, let me welcome Tim Padgett.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and thank you, Calvin, and thank you to the Tower Forum for this very kind invitation and this opportunity for this discussion, this very important discussion, as Calvin said, a very timely one. And I would emphasize that this is a constructive discussion. This is South Florida. This particular issue can arouse passions here. I would just remind everyone, panel and audience alike, that everyone agrees that our aim is to change the status quo in communist Cuba. The debate we're having is just over the best way to bring that about as we now near the end of the Castro era. And so I would just remind everyone of the sign I saw across the street on the Methodist Church as we were coming in that said, "Let us slander no one." It's there. You can check it out. And with that, then, I would like to ask our panel then to please come up and let me introduce them. Our distinguished panel, I should say. At the end of the table there is Coral Gables Mayor James Kaysen. He was our de facto ambassador in Cuba as head of the U.S. interest section in Havana from 2002 to 2005. Mayor Kaysen was best known for widely traveling the island to help dissidents set up independent libraries. And for his work, the Cuban government rewarded him with barring him from leaving Havana. He was a 40-year career diplomat for the State Department and as well as an ambassador in countries like Paraguay, and then was elected mayor of Coral Gables in 2011. So let's please welcome Mayor Kaysen. To his left is Frank Calzone. He's the executive director of the Center for a Free Cuba in Washington, D.C. The group promotes human rights and a transition to democracy on the island. Mr. Calzone was born in Cuba and is a strong defender of the U.S. trade embargo against the Castro regime. He has been repeatedly featured in national newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and he's appeared on television programs ranging from the PBS NewsHour to Fox News. Mr. Calzone has also testified before congressional committees and often speaks at universities here and abroad. Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Calzone. To his left is Alfredo Duran. He is a founding director of the Cuban Committee for Democracy. Mr. Duran was also born in Cuba and is a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was, in fact, a president. He was, in fact, a president of the Bay of Pigs Veterans Association, but his eventual call for peaceful dialogue with Cuba led to his break with that group. Mr. Duran is a former Miami-Dade School Board member and a former chair of the Florida Democratic Party. Welcome, Mr. Duran. And to his left, finally, Mr. Ricardo Herrero. He is the Executive Director of Cuba Now, which advocates engagement with Cuba. Mr. Herrero is an attorney and the son of Cuban exiles. He was previously the Deputy Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group in Washington. He is a former Executive Director of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party and served on the 2012 presidential campaign of Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Capriles. His articles have appeared in the Huffington Post, USA Today, and the Miami Herald, among others, and he has appeared frequently on TV, including CNN in Español. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
Mayor Kaysen, I want to start with you, and I want to start where you and I sort of left off a few weeks ago during an on-air conversation we were having on WLRN that has to do with the central premise that President Obama laid out for why he undertook this very dramatic, very historic change in the U.S.'s policy towards Cuba. And that premise was, as he said in his State of the Union address as well, if something isn't working after 50 years, you can't expect this, a different result. You have to move on to a different approach. You pointed out, however, that central premise you thought was wrong. That while the policy of isolating Cuba and the embargo had not brought about regime change in Cuba, the policy had still been a success. And I was wondering if you could tell us why you think the policy of the past half century has actually worked, and therefore why the central premise of Mr. Obama's policy is flawed.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Tower Forum for inviting me to participate in this. It's always great to talk about Cuba. My views stem from my experience 3 years in Cuba. My personal view is that nobody's policy has worked in Cuba. If you look at what's happened over the last 55 years, you find that all of the countries in the world except the United States have engaged with Cuba. They have traded, they have sent tourists, they've invested probably, I would guess, over $100 billion has probably come into Cuba over that time. And the belief that engaging will change the political system, if that's what you mean by works, if that's what you believe, it's failed. I think it's a policy that unless we're exceptional, American exceptionalism, or I always say unless we have democratic pixie dust, the fact that Americans are going to go there, most of whom who will be going in the future probably don't speak Spanish, and somehow the money will trickle down to the Cuban people, or that the Cuban government will change its determination to maintain the communist system and perfect it. I just don't see it. I mean, I hope it works, but hope's not a policy.
Mrs. Duran, I just wanted to ask you off the bat, what led you a quarter century ago, more than a quarter century ago, to come to the conclusion that engaging Communist Cuba was the best way to go?
When the Soviet Union disappeared and the Cold War was over, I came to the conclusion that if we continue on the same path that had not worked for so many years, and that every president from Kennedy to the present president have tried to negotiate with Cuba the end of the embargo, and every time Cuba does something so that the embargo will not end, because the embargo is the one thing that protects Cuba and gives it an excuse for everything that is wrong within the island and keeps it from doing what is right. Deny civil rights, deny political rights, deny everything, because they allege that they're at war with the United States, because no friendly country embargoes another friendly country. Therefore, they're at war, and they have to take extraordinary actions to protect themselves from the United States. When the Soviet Union disappeared, I thought that it was about time that we Cubans started talking to each other. The Cold War was over. The difference between the United States and the Soviet Union was over. I thought that the future of Cuba would continue to be going on as it has been going on. And I thought that it was time that Cubans started talking to each other in a civic dialogue that would someday bring about normalization, civil rights, political rights to the Cuban people. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and the reason it has not happened is for the same reason that the embargo is still in place, because the Cuban government does not want the embargo lifted, nor does it want to bring any opening to the political situation of Cuba. So what is for a simple Cuban to do? Continue arguing the point, continue telling that we must have a dialogue with the Cuban people, continue saying that after the 2 or 3 historical figures in Cuba are dead, and there's only 2 or 3 that are still walking around, changes will come about, and they're going to be generational changes. And the United States government and the Cuban people in exile must begin a dialogue with those that are going to be the next generation of government in Cuba. That's the only thing that is going to bring about a better Cuba, normalization, civil rights, and political rights to all Cubans.
Mr. If I could ask you to refrain from applause, please. Mr. Calzone, when President Obama announced in December that he wanted to reestablish diplomatic ties with Cuba, you have made the point since then that he was actually couldn't have made this decision at a worse time, because Cuba seems to be at one of its weakest points in terms of international patrons. That its latest patron, Venezuela, is on the ropes, and that therefore this was the moment to actually tighten the screws rather than engage Cuba. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on then why historically this was such a mistake.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me thank the forum for inviting me. Like most Cubans, I would like to see the day in which in Cuba there would be a group of folks like this, lawyers, businessmen, independent people, that could get together to talk about an issue without being afraid of being taken away by the police. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. What I said when the president made the announcement was a little bit more than that. I said, for example, that the president had early on talked about transparency, and he had conducted 18 months a secret negotiation that even key people in the State Department didn't learn about until about 3 or 4 months ago. I also said, frankly, being a Cuban, that I don't know why the president thinks that by talking to Raul Castro, that both of them could determine the future of Cuba. The future of Cuba belongs to the Cuban people. They have to be at the negotiating table. I also said that the president announced a policy that is full of misunderstanding and misconceptions. He read some things, I guess, from the teleprompter that are really nonsense, I'm sorry to say. When people say that the president wants to reestablish relations with Cuba, the United States has had diplomatic relations with Cuba since 1977. The American mission in Cuba, where Ambassador Cason served, is the largest diplomatic mission in Cuba and has been for many years. There are more American diplomats in Cuba than there are Canadians, or the French, or the Russians. So it's not for lack of a diplomatic presence in Cuba that we are where we are. Then I also said, and I stop here, that the notion of saying, well, if something hasn't worked, we got to do something else. Well, the something else has to work. Just because something doesn't work, you just pick up another option. And as the ambassador here on my right has said, the French, the Canadian, the Japanese, the Spaniards, all of them have sent millions of tourists to Cuba. All of them have traded with Cuba. All of them have given loans to Cuba. That hasn't changed the repressive regime in Cuba. So what the president is doing is changing from a policy that many people think it hasn't worked to a policy that we know it hasn't worked. And that's my answer.
Mr. Herrero, why do most Cuban Americans of your younger generation believe that it's time to engage the island?
Simple. We've lived under this policy our entire lives, and we've yet to see it yield any sort of result whatsoever.
I think you want to get close a little bit.
Oh, sorry. We've seen that for basically as long as I've been around, almost as long as I've been around, our policy towards Cuba has been dictated primarily by South Florida politics, not by a sober assessment of what's the correct approach towards that country, or what's in the best interest of the United States. And I've seen that process. I myself was, when I grew up in a household where My parents were, staunchly in favor of the embargo, believed that trying to choke that economy was going to be the best way to bring about change in the island. And I came up believing the same. It wasn't until I had an opportunity to visit the island in 2000 that I realized that our policy was grossly overreaching and was really actually aggravating the issue. I got to go on a family trip where I got to meet a couple of young, very entrepreneurial Cubans in Havana who were basically street hustling. They were making ends meet by working with tourists, driving them around, doing anything they had to do to raise some money so that they can take it home and feed their families. And their dream was to start their own businesses in Miami, leave the island and start their own business in Miami. And I would ask them why, and it was because there's absolutely no opportunity here. And I thought, well, if everybody who's young and with any sort of drive and initiative, if their dream is to get out of this country, this is never going to change. And I thought, well, what are we doing to help remedy this? And that's when I realized that the answer was absolutely nothing. Our policy is only aggravating the situation. Instead of being able to bring the international community together to help exert pressure towards the Castro regime, we've isolated ourselves from the international community. They've run the other way because they don't want to be seen as aligned with this overreaching policy that's as codified in the Helms-Burton Act and Cuba Democracy Act. It's done nothing to help civil society in the island, to empower them in any way. It's given us no leverage with the Cubans to help to push for changes. They don't respond to basically anything that we say on this side. And it hasn't achieved, so overall it hasn't achieved its objectives. It hasn't ushered in a democratic transition. So when you grow up your entire life seeing that this is the approach and it's not doing anything, yet you see also that when we engage with Cubans in the island, you're sharing ideas, when you open up the flow of resources to them, they take every opportunity to try to get ahead on their own right. Then you see that there's an opportunity there to build something new that can render the old system irrelevant. And I think that that's why folks my age seem to be a lot more open to a different policy.
Now, Mayor Kaysen, let's again go back to the rationale then for President Obama's policy change. He believes that while this new policy won't make or democratize Cuba overnight, I think his feeling is that it will at least position the United States more effectively to take advantage of change should it come when the Castros disappear from the scene. So if that's the rationale for the policy change, Mayor Kaysen, you, however, made the point to me a few weeks ago, that, and just a couple days ago, I think, that you don't even think that normalization is really going to have a chance to occur under this process.
Yes, I don't think it will, because, and I think the Cubans have said very clearly, read my lips recently, that we are not going to allow anything that you do to change our view of the political, what we want to do with the political system. I mean, they've been very clear. We want to take the money that you're going to give to the military, which runs all the economy there, and we're going to use it to continue to perfect communism and the system that we have. There's a big difference between diplomatic relations, which, if you look up the definition, it means you have diplomats in each other's countries. As Mr. Calzone said, we've had that since 1977. We have basically the largest embassy, except we don't have the name on the door and we can't use the American flag. I don't see that diplomatic relations per se gains us much. What we really need is normalization, and there's at least 15 things that have to be done that I've come up with. And I've been in conversations, migration accord talks with the Cubans over the 3 years that I was there. They need to allow our diplomats to normally pursue what diplomats do, and part of what we do is always defending our values. And the Cubans just a couple of days ago made clear that we don't want your diplomats to do what diplomats do. They restrict us to a number of 51 employees, and they restrict the number of TDYs that we can have to make it so we can't be effective. They don't let us travel outside of Havana. They interfere with our diplomatic pouch. They refuse to have a postal service. They don't allow internet to reach the average Cuban person. They harass our diplomats. They won't let, if you're a Canadian and you invite an American diplomat to to your diplomatic residence, the Cubans refuse to go. Nor will the Cubans allow us to speak with anybody other than the head of the North American affairs, who is a Ministry of Interior official disguised as a diplomat. The point is, unless we think they're dumb, they are not going to. They listen to what the president says. He says, we're going to do this because we're going to empower the Cuban people. Well, the Cubans have said, we're not going to allow them to be empowered. We're going to maintain our system. They're not going to participate in it. So the view that somehow they are so dumb as to not be, they know they can control it. They've controlled everybody else's efforts to do this, to change their system, and they're not going to do it. And they're not going to allow normalization, because that would mean that our diplomats can travel around, we can bring in the materials we want, as they do in Washington. So normalization, I predict, will not happen. I hope it will. Maybe someday when the Castros are gone, I think there's a chance. But until they begin, the Cuban government creating institutions that allow the Cuban people to participate, only they can empower the Cuban people, not our foreign policy.
Mr. Calzon, I know you. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have?
No, that's.
Mr. Calzon, I know you wanted to make a rebuttal to what Mr. Herrero had just said, but if I could ask you first, though, to follow up on what the mayor, the point he just made, with another point that you have made, that this can't work because we simply gave too much away to the Cubans from the outset. We made too many concessions without asking enough from them in return, and I was wondering if you could address that point.
Well, if you look at what the president has done and what the president is talking about doing, is basically what the Cuban government has been asking for a long time. When you hear some folks talking about Cuba policy, you ought to put that on a blackboard and say, this is what the Cuban government wants. The Cuban government wants the embargo lifted. The Cuban government wants to be removed from the list of countries that support international terrorism, despite the fact that in Cuba there are American terrorists who killed American police officers who went to prison, escaped, and are in Cuba. And if you go to the FBI webpage, you'll see that one of those terrorists who murdered an American is one of the 10 most wanted in the FBI list. Cuba is the only country in the list of countries that support terrorism who has publicly acknowledged that there is a murder of an American police officer who's welcome there. I think that has to be taken into account. The other thing that I just wanted to say something, which it's again, when you hear the Cuban government talk, the Cuban government says, for example, that the American foreign policy on Cuba is based on South Florida, as if the Cuban Americans have not earned the right to have a point of view. In case some of you don't know, I'm sure all of you know, Cuban Americans have been here for 50-some years. Cuban Americans pay taxes. They serve in the armed forces. They become presidents of universities. They have a point of view. And if you want to go to the Vietnam War, I could show you where you could put your hand on the names of Cuban Americans who have died serving the American flag. I think the Cuban Americans have the same right as the Jewish community, black community, the gay community, anybody else, to have a point of view. What controls American policy toward Cuba is not the Cuban American community. What controls the Cuban policy about Cuba are the actions of the Castro dictatorship. It is not the Cuban Americans who send a large police contingent to Venezuela to beat up dissidents and to train the Venezuelan police forces. It is not the Cuban exiles who would like to go back to the Cold War. The president wants to forget about the Cold War. Raul Castro wants to go back to the Cold War. He wants to open up a spy station that had been closed back in Cuba. While the American diplomats were in Cuba, before they got there, a Soviet spy ship showed up in Havana. Raul Castro has in Cuba's national bank, look it up in your newspaper, there has been a lot of fraud with Medicaid and Medicare. And at least in one case, and there are many others, $300 million were stolen from Medicaid and Medicare. The money is now in Cuba's national bank. Is that a savings account Shouldn't the administration said to Mr. Castro, give us the money right now before we talk about anything else? It's your money. It's taxpayers' money. And apparently the administration is not interested in getting your money back.
And Mr. Calzone, if I could just then ask Mr. Duran to follow up on that point. That is, I think that's if I could just ask Mr. Duran really quickly, though, to follow up on that point, which is a central one, I think, that Cuba policy for too long in the United States has been based, in the eyes of many, on Cuban exile anger, which, albeit is very justified, obviously, but is not the basis for sound foreign policy, perhaps. I was wondering if you could address that aspect.
That's been precisely the point, and that is why it is so important what President Obama has done. Up until now, U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba did not exist. It was U.S. policy for the elections, to get electoral votes in New Jersey and in Florida, and to get political contributions from wealthy Cubans in New Jersey and in Florida. That is what has determined U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba until now. For the first time, there is a foreign policy towards Cuba, and that is what Obama is doing. He's taking the best interest of the United States into account and not electoral policy nor political contributions. The fact of the matter is that we're going to have to deal with Cuba because changes are coming. Like I said before, there's only 2 or 3 that still walk around, and they all have more than 85, 87, 89 years old. They cannot last much longer, and you have a new generation that is taking over. And if you take a look at the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Cuba, almost 90% are under 55 years of age. Those people were not in the Sierra Maestra with Fidel Castro. Those people don't have the same ideological need to be historical figures like Fidel Castro. Those people want changes, and they're going to do their own form of government, and the United States should be already trying to make contact, talk to them, and make changes. Because you know what's going to happen when the Castro disappears? Miami, Florida, and Havana, and Cuba are going to be China and Hong Kong. I don't know yet who's going to be China and who's going to be Hong Kong, but that's what's going to happen. You're going to have a tremendous flow of people, of business going back and forth, and you better start looking forward to that event, which is coming sooner rather than later.
But Mr. Duran, is a better way to put this, though, that this policy is essentially a new bet replacing an old bet, in the sense that we are betting with this new policy that when the Castros are gone, we will see a sort of Gorbachev-like presence emerge in Cuba that we will be better situated than to take advantage of. Is that essentially?
No, I just don't understand how anybody can think that something that hasn't worked in 55 years is going to work in the next 55 years. It just doesn't work. The policy has not worked because it has nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. It has to do with political policy and political contributions.
And Mr.
You can govern U.S. policy towards Cuba by just contributing money to 2 or 3 chairmen of subcommittees that have to do with Latin America and the Caribbean and Cuba. And most of those chairmen are from states that don't even know where Cuba is. So it's very easy to form Cuba policy.
Mr. Herrera, if you could follow up on that point, and then there's another I would like to ask as well.
Just to respond to Mr. Calzone, the year that Castro shot down the Brothers to the Rescue planes, 1996, was a presidential election year. Clinton was up for re-election. There was a bill making the rounds in Congress that really was not seen as having any shot of getting passed because it was so overreaching. It had this very troublesome, constitutionally suspicious, suspect extraterritorial provisions. And it just didn't seem like it had much traction. The bill was Helms-Burton. It's the law that codifies all embargo sanctions and puts them in the hands of Congress and conditions the lifting of all of them, not even a sort of tit-for-tat quid pro quo, but the lifting of all sanctions on a series of conditions that the Cuban government must meet, and it must meet all of them before we can even lift one of these, right? Bill wasn't expected to go anywhere. But the Cubans shot down the Brothers to the Rescue planes. It was an election year. Clinton signed the bill. he recognized in his own biography that signing that bill was good election year politics in Florida, but that it tied his hands to be able to lift the embargo in the future in exchange, through negotiations, for positive changes in the island. So it is very much about South Florida politics. Now, as far as what the bet is, look, the bet is that you can't micromanage a transition in Cuba from Coral Gables, right, or from Washington. A change in Cuba has to come from within. It's got to come from the people. It's got to be homegrown democracy. They have to want it, and the best way that we can help facilitate that is by opening up the flow of contacts, resources, capital, information to the Cuban people so that they can be in a better position to make greater demands from that government. So that's the bet of this policy, that we're empowering civil society, we're empowering all sectors of the Cuban people so that they're in a better position. They can, put food on the table, better provide for, their basic needs, and then we'll be in a better position to make greater demands from that government.
But what about this argument that Mr. Calzone brings up, that in so doing, we are simply giving too much away to get to that point?
Well, we're not giving anything away because we're not making any concessions. Part of the problem with Helms-Burton is that it created this idea that somehow removing sanctions that haven't brought any sort of solution whatsoever, haven't produced their intended outcomes, for steps that we want the Cubans to take but they're not inclined to take, are somehow tradable commodities. They're not. We're replacing a bad policy with a more promising policy. We're doing what's in the best interest of the United States and we believe will be in the best interest of the Cuban people. So we're not giving anything away. The value of a failed policy is zero for everybody except for those who have benefited from the status quo that policy creates. So it's not a concession. Again, it's just a reform of a policy trying to do something that finally achieves its objectives.
Mayor Kaysen, when I first visited Cuba in 1990, the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the special period, as they called it, which was one of the worst economic periods in Cuban history, the economy was in free fall, the suffering was terrible, and every day I would wake up and walk around and see empty shelves and empty tables and houses, etc. And I kept saying to myself, there's no way they can survive this. But yet somehow they did. And we've come now to a point where Venezuela is about to collapse, their newest sponsor. And again, people are saying there's no way they can survive this. But journalistically, empirically, I have to look back over the past quarter century and I have to remind myself they always seem to find a way to survive it. And I think one of the reasons is because unilateral embargoes don't seem to work. I think one of the reasons we were able to successfully confront apartheid in South Africa, for example, was because that was a multilateral international effort, and those do work, whereas unilateral efforts historically don't. But back to this moment in history then, because Venezuela is so weak right now, I'd like to go back to that point about your argument that, and Mr. Calzone's argument that this was not the right time to do this because this was exactly the time when we could have put the squeeze on Cuba.
Well, look, Cuba survived in part because, one, it's an island, two, it's got very good security forces. They have been getting life preservers after the end of the Soviet Union from Venezuela oil. They always seem to find a sugar daddy when things are tough. When things are tough, what they do is they liberalize in terms of micro enterprises. They did it when I was there, and as soon as money flows in from whatever it is, then they cut back the number of licenses. I mean, they only license like 157 little occupations like filling cigarette lighters, and they have paladares, which are restaurants, but a lot of those are, I mean, some are actually individuals doing it, but a lot of them are just relatives of the military that now have a way to invest the money they've gotten from corruption in the island in enterprises. But what they tend to do is in bad times they open up a little bit, and when the money comes in, they tighten up again. I think that Yeah, this was a very difficult time for them. It's very unlikely that Venezuela, Russia, Iran, everybody else is going to be in a position with oil prices plunging to continue to provide all that money. So one of the reasons that they were able to survive is that the Europeans have invested billions and billions of dollars in the island. They don't ever pay them back. What they really want from the embargo, not so much American tourists, they want American loans guaranteed by Exim Bank and others, because they have never paid back the loans given by the other countries, and they're not about to pay this back with us. That's what they really want from what's left of the embargo. They want the taxpayers to be able to, on the hook to pay for all these foodstuffs, which when they do come in, and by the way, they can buy all the food, anything organic from the United States. They've been able to do it for over 10 years. They bought billions of dollars of food from us. Even the newspaper for grandma comes from the United States, telephone poles, medicine, any of that stuff they want to buy, they can. So all that's really left of the embargo is bathing suit tourists can't go, and we don't allow loans to a government that won't pay them back. So I think what happens is, yeah, we've thrown them a lifeline out at a time that it will give them another renewed life for the regime, because all that money that comes from American tourists, the few that are going to be able to find rooms in Havana, because most of them are full, the money's going to go straight to the military, which runs the cigars, the tobacco, the rum, and all the hotels and all the tourist industry. So I think, why do we keep throwing lifelines? Again, my view is that when people say it hasn't worked, back to what I said originally, nobody's policies worked, unfortunately. You name a policy that works and I'll support it, but engagement is the most failed policy, because the rest of the world's been doing it for 50 years.
But Mr. Duran, what about that argument that Raul Castro never would have agreed to normalization in the first place if he hadn't been so desperate? And that desperation is the best argument for why we shouldn't have pursued engagement right now. We should have continued with what we're doing.
Raul Castro has not agreed to normalization. As a matter of fact, he just said in Honduras that the only way that he would normalize relations with Cuba if the United States paid an indemnization for all the damages that they had, and it goes into the billions of dollars.
He's used a $1 trillion figure at one point.
Right. So it's they don't want normalization. That's what people don't get in their mind. The Cuban government does not want normal relations with the United States. It goes against their best interest. They want the things as they are, and the most terrible thing that is happening in Cuba right now is that everybody wants to leave Cuba. I have not heard in the past 10 years any Cuban that feels love for Cuba. They all want to leave, and they want to leave to the United States, and that's the most unfortunate thing. You don't see one single person that gets off an airplane or gets off a boat that says, I want to go back to Cuba because I want to liberate Cuba. No, they say, I want to come to the United States because I want to send money back to my family in Cuba. They're acting not as political refugees, not as people who want to change the government. They're acting as immigrants. And that is the most terrible thing that is happening in Cuba, because the Cuban people have lost love for the island. Yeah. They just want to leave, especially the young people.
And Mr. Calzone and Mr. Herrera, just briefly, if you could both address that point, why should we at this point have let the embargo work, as you would argue?
Well, that has never been my point. My point is that the embargo should be used to condition real change in Cuba. No one is really defending, first of all, the embargo. We keep saying the embargo. The embargo today is not the same thing that was in 1960. The idea that nothing has been done in Cuba during all this time is simply not true. When Ambassador Kaysen was in Cuba, he distributed 30,000 shortwave radios. That's the strategy of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Those things are important, but neither the Cuban government nor the advocates for the Cuban government want to concede that. Something just came out here out of blue, and you probably don't know. On the one hand, Mr. Herrero says that it's just the South Florida votes or whatever. By the way, what Mr. Duran says about contributions, that's not only Cuban. any political science know how the Congress works. So if you're concerned about Cuba, you should be concerned with Middle East policy. You should be concerned about the gay.
Your ex-friend Jorge Mascanosa was the one who found that out, and he was the biggest supporter of
my
that.
point is that this is not a Cuba-specific issue.
We all know that. We all know that.
No, not everybody. Well, you don't
We
make
all
it.
know that.
Well, let me go back to what I want to say, because the Cuba policy is not simply the votes, and we're in the democracy, or the contribution, but lives. Mr. Herrero says that the brothers to the rescue. I don't know if you know what happened here, but there were 4 young men, one who was born in New Jersey, another one who served in Vietnam, and they were looking for refugees on the Florida Straits. And Cuban MiGs came out and destroyed those planes in international airspace. One spy had something to do with that. That man was sentenced to 2 life sentences. And that man, who had something to do with the death of Americans, was exchanged by the president. And the mother of at least one of those who died told me, it was just like seeing my son die one more time. How could it be? Now, I guess anybody who wants to kill Americans can then get some government to blackmail the president and get the freedom for the murderer. I think we have to take that into account. And American lives are at risk, not simply a game. Now, when you say that people benefited, just let me say this. Mr. Herrera always talks about the people who benefited from the old policy. Well, what about the people who want to benefit for the new policy? What about the businessmen, some of them that you work for, who want to go to Cuba and pay $20 a month in an environment where you don't have a labor union, you don't have a right to strike, and they talk that Cubans don't know about freedom? I don't know if you haven't heard, but they're having thousands of political prisoners in Cuba. There are many leaders in Cuba who want to stay in Cuba and fight for Cuba and love Cuba. So whenever somebody says to you, all Cubans, that's not true.
Can you finish
there
up
are
on
all kinds of Cubans.
Can you finish up on that point then, Mr. Herrera?
Yeah, just a couple points. It was mostly driven by South Florida politics. What we've seen in recent elections is that Cuba is no longer the third rail of South Florida politics the way it used to be. We saw that with the 2012 campaign where Obama won close to 50% of the Cuban American vote. We saw this in the most recent campaign where Charlie Crist, even though he lost, also won close to 50% of the Cuban American vote, and I think about 30,000 more votes than Alex Sink had in 2010 in Miami-Dade. What I want to go back to is a couple of the other points that have been mentioned.
Just briefly, please. Yeah.
I'll try to be very brief. We constantly call the Castro government liars, crooks, that can't be trusted, yet whenever they make, fine, but then why, whenever they make a full-throated demand for a lifting of the embargo, do we believe that it's what they really want? Let's think about that for a second. Second, during the special period, GDP in Cuba dropped 35% over the course of 4 years. 35%, and they were able to survive that. It is estimated that if they lose Venezuelan subsidies, the GDP drop would be about 10%. Let's say if it gets to 20%, still nowhere near 35%. And this is at a time where they're trading with the rest of the world. So to think that this was a time when they were going to just sort of bow down to the Americans and give in to our demands is not really based on reality. If anything, all they would have to do is just open up their economy even more. And why should we be taking these steps now? Look, Fidel, we know, if he's not dead already, he's probably going to pass away soon. After 10 years of retirement, this is how effective our policy has been. His brother has announced that he is stepping down in 2018 and has instituted term limits. We'll see if they honor that. But we know that they're at the twilight of this era. We know that there is a transition in place. Should we be standing on the sidelines and waiting and hoping for the best without trying to play a constructive role, or should we be engaging directly and trying to influence that process as much as possible? I think we could be much more influential in the future of Cuba by playing a constructive role in the present than by sitting on the sidelines.
And that role, and this is the last question I want to address to the panel before we open it up to questions then, because this is such a business-oriented group, I think it's appropriate that we make the point, and Roberta Jacobson has made this point, she is the top U.S. negotiator for normalization, the normalization process with Cuba for the U.S. State Department. She has repeatedly made the point that the focus here of this new policy is empowering, as you had pointed out, these fledgling entrepreneurs in Cuba, that by giving them more economic power and therefore more civil independence in Cuba, you undermine, perhaps not in the way that Solidarity did in Poland, but you nonetheless undermine communist authority in Cuba, and that really is the end game of this new policy, empowering these new capitalists in Cuba so that we can undermine the Castro regime in that way. Mayor Kaysen, you believe that's a flawed,
definitely
flawed approach?
Look at
and if I could just ask you, all of you, to keep your answers very brief on this, and so we can.
I do, because at least $100 billion has come in over 50 years. The average income in Cuba is $20. The Cuban government knows how to quarantine that money. It goes to the military, which runs the repressive forces. The idea that micro enterprises will, by supporting them, that they're going to be able to change the government. The government has said we are not changing. And they know how to control that. So I just think the idea of trickle down is going to empower the Cuban people. No, they're going to be empowered when the Cuban government invites them to participate in the dialogue on the future.
Mr. Duran?
Some of the most successful Cuban businessmen in Florida have been traveling to Cuba to look at the possibilities of doing business in Cuba. They've all come back with very interesting opinions. But the one in particular, Carlos Saladrigas, went together with the Catholic Church and started doing seminars all over Cuba about teaching the Cubans how to run small enterprises. They were so successful that the Cuban government took Carlos Saladrigas, put him in a plane, and sent him back to Miami. That's how fearful they are of private business.
Thank you. Mr. Calzone?
Yeah, well, if you believe that the Cuban government does not want to receive millions of dollars to support their government, which is what's happening under this policy, then I guess I could sell you the 7 Mile Bridge or something. But the idea of trading with Cuba, trading and getting paid is not the same thing. And there are lots of people who trade with Cuba and don't get paid. Finally, yes, I know about the Cuban-American businessmen who want to go to Cuba. And I know some of those Cuban-American businessmen who go and put the maquilladoras across the border in Mexico. But Cubans don't want the Cuban workers to get paid $20 or $30 a month, which is the great attraction for these businessmen, because they don't have to deal with labor union, and if a worker says something about the environment, they're sent to prison. Those are the Cuban businessmen they want. We want Cuba not to be like China or Vietnam. We want Cuba to be like the United States or like Costa Rica. Why not? Why couldn't the Cubans be like anybody else? And the idea that you're missing an opportunity. Cuba has something that the U.S. will never miss any opportunity. It's called 90 miles. The island is not going to move anywhere. The Cuban people have known for many years that the American people have been on their side.
Frank, the only difference.
And now somebody's telling the Cuban people that the American government is on the side of Raul Castro. That's a disaster.
Mr. Herrera?
Frank, there's only two ways that that's
Mr. Herrera, if I could just ask Mr. Herrera to weigh in on that.
The two largest protests that we've seen in the last 2 years in Cuba were actually protests by entrepreneurs who were protesting. That's the truth. The ones with the largest attendance. It is, Frank. There was one with 500 people in the street, and they were mostly entrepreneurs. I know you don't want to recognize entrepreneurs.
Look at the Amnesty International
if I may,
report.
It's my turn. Amnesty, by the way, has called for a lifting of the embargo, and so has Human Rights Watch. Our policy, again, it goes back to whether we're trying to micromanage a transition from the United States, not visit Cuba, not talk to Cuba, and just hope that by us demanding everything, they'll do everything we want, or trying to engage in constructive ways and empower civil society. Now, civil society is not just a handful of dissidents that agree with a particular policy here. It's everybody that is opposed to the government, the entire opposition movement, all dissidents, but not only that, entrepreneurs, academics, artists, anybody who is seeking to increase their autonomy from the state, they're the folks that we should be helping, and that's what this policy is geared towards.
And I would point out that in the end, I think what the Obama administration is hoping is that business people like you will be able to directly invest with or help entrepreneurs in that way as well. Some might call that a pipe dream, but I think that's the end game of the policy. We really should now open it up to questions from you. Sure. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Charles Broner. Question is oil prices are this is loud. Oil prices are at historic lows right now. Venezuela seems to be in a little financial difficulty. Drilling off the Cuban coast could cause billions of dollars of damage here in South Florida. Do you think oil had a big part of this new openness with the United States?
I don't think so, because when I was there, you had a number of foreign companies that came in with a hope that they were going to find oil. They drilled and they didn't find any oil offshore that was commercial. And they might continue in some other areas, but that was those are the sorts of things that we were able to discuss when I was there. I mean, it's not like we've never been talking with the Cubans. We've talked about migration, hurricanes, illegal immigrants, drug traffickers, those sorts of things. We can talk about that, and we have talked about it, but I don't think that's had much to do with it.
Next question.
Current policy has allowed people who come from Cuba, once they set foot here, to stay. In more recent years, the Sun Sentinel just recently reported that because people can come here and after a year and a day be allowed to go back, we've got a criminal pipeline of people who are coming from Cuba, ripping off Medicare, ripping off Medicaid, doing insurance fraud, which leads to the premiums in South Florida being through the roof. I know you all don't think the embargo should be lifted or that relations change, but should the Cuban Adjustment Act be changed?
Well, more than the Cuban Adjustment Act, I believe that people who break the law should go to jail. And I think that when the Cuban government provides refuge for those people and refuses to return the money, it gives you a pretty good idea of who you're dealing with.
But is the Cuban Adjustment Act, though, responsible in some way for the phenomenon that she's describing?
To that, I would say, there's no Mexican Adjustment Act. There's no Salvadorian Adjustment Act. The Cuban will continue to come unless the United States has a serious policy that if you break the law, we'll go after you, and also unless the American government takes a look at the operations of the Cuban security services here, because sending $300 million to the Cuban bank is not just a person here. It's the Cuban government. It's the Cuban intelligence service who's doing that, and we should not ignore that.
Mr. Duran, you want to weigh in?
I think that we're very close to see the end of the Cuban Adjustment Act. I think there's a strong feeling, not only in Congress, but even in politicians here in South Florida, even in this county commission in Miami-Dade County, there were some expressions to that effect. As far as Medicare fraud, there's Medicare fraud all over the United States. It's just not Cubans are committing Medicare fraud. It's a crime, and it should be punished. But the Cuban Adjustment Act is something that as time has passed, and I think that there's very strong sentiment among U.S. in Congress and among Florida politicians that it's about time to end. And for the first time, I think in the past couple of months, we are hearing a debate about that, even in the Miami-Dade County Commission.
Next question? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. With all the demands that Raul Castro has made on the United States recently, I'm just wondering, has anything been said or done to try to replace the assets that our original Cubans gave up when they came to the United States. We had many, many people move here penniless.
You want to?
Yeah, one of the things that's going to have to be discussed in the whole long, frustrating process of normalization, if we ever get there, is going to be the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. There are about 6,700 claims that total $7 or $8 billion now for American citizens at the time whose properties were taken. Then there's the question of all of the people that left their goods on the island because they were not allowed to leave even with rings on. So yeah, that's going to be a big discussion, and it's been a discussion with a lot of countries. It's a long process, and usually you get 10 cents on the dollar in a bond or a tax credit or something, but obviously that's one of the major issues to be discussed. And the Cubans, what the Cubans will say, because they said it when I was there, well, once the embargo's gone, you owe us between $100 billion and $1 trillion because you have decided not to trade with us. And so you get rid of the embargo, they have another excuse, that's this one. Of course, we're never going to do that, and they want the Guantanamo back.
Let me just add to this, because this is an interesting aspect, and it's going to affect all Cubans that are here. As far as the Cubans' properties, there were very few Cuban properties that were actually confiscated by law decree. I mean, most of the Cubans left their property, and they abandoned their property. And it's just like in Florida. If you don't pay your taxes during 7 years, you lose your property. And that is what's happening in Cuba. And that is one of the biggest debate which has never been settled in Eastern Europe yet. What happens when you leave your property and you don't pay taxes on it for 7 years? Now, that's one thing. The other thing is that Cuba has settled all of its foreign asset loans with everybody, except the United States. And the reason, even though they made an offer to settle the question of U.S. property interest, is because they wanted to settle the property interest that they confiscated of American properties at the value that the American companies reported in Cuba for tax purposes. And they had already got tax deductions here for 10 times what they reported the value of the taxes in Cuba. And that is why Cuba came to an agreement with every country in the world except the United States. Because, for instance, a company that lost a farm, a U.S. company that lost a farm, a sugar farm, in Cuba got a tax deduction here of $1,000, let's say, while they reported the value of that property in Cuba for $100. And that is the difference which has never been settled between the United States, because the companies don't want them to be paid because they already tax deducted those properties by much more value than they had reported to the Cuban government.
Okay, Mr. Calzone has a very quick rebuttal to that point, and then Mr. Herrera would like to weigh in very quickly about the Cuban Adjustment Act as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry to have to say, but that's the position that the Cuban government promotes. And the idea that Cubans left their property, I guess we could say to the Jews that left Germany, you left your property. We know how we came. We came with nothing. We came with $5 in the pocket. The view that the Cubans left their country, the Cubans were forced out. People were in prison. Other people were executed. And now you're repeating the Cuban government
But the difference
stuff.
is that you're going to take the property from those people who've been living it for 55 years. That is the same argument that is going on in Eastern Europe.
You're changing the argument.
We do, gentlemen, we do need to get to other questions. So if Mr. Herrera could just weigh in on the Cuban Adjustment Act, and then we'll go to the next question.
Going back to the less touchy subject of the Cuban Adjustment Act, I agree with Frank that criminals should be prosecuted and thrown in jail. But not having normalized diplomatic relations, not having banking relations, not having having travel restrictions, makes it harder to go after these people than otherwise having these relations, right? Because if it's just cash only, if we're not talking to the Cubans, if we're make it harder for law enforcement and others to be even able to go after these people on the island, how are we ever going to get them? So the Cuban Adjustment Act enables this, but so does the embargo. And I think that as far as the Cuban Adjustment Act is concerned, it seems very immoral to me at this juncture to say we're going to close the door to everyone else who's trying to come here seeking a better life, even though the same regime is still in power. Yet we're going to keep this policy in place that's trying to destroy your economy. I feel that what we should do is take a look and revisit our entire legislative framework towards Cuba so that we can finally have a coherent policy towards the island. If there's been enough changes to revisit the Adjustment Act, then I think we can agree there's been enough changes to revisit the embargo.
And can we go to a question from this side of the room then? I think we had, yes, the young lady back there.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Beverly Benjamin. I understand that Raul Castro has a son who serves as a captain in the Cuban Army and trained in Russia. Is this in fact being someone who's being groomed to the next?
You know, nobody really knows. I personally believe that the Cuban government wants a succession, not a transition. In fact, when I was there, they had a series of 9 cartoons called Cosas y Casos de Cabo Quezon about me, in which the whole political purpose of these 9 cartoons was to show that the Cubans were going to be better off with a succession, not a transition to democracy, because then you would have to pay for medical, you know, all of these sorts of arguments they use. It's possible that he's being groomed, but also it's possible one of the 5 heroes, one of the spies that's come back, could be groomed, because they're bringing them out now. They've been they've gone through prison. They've remained firm with the regime. They become heroes. So I wouldn't overlook the possibility of one of the released murderers being groomed. We just have to wait and see. But I think it's going to be a succession. They certainly don't want to transition to democracy.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I think that the changes in Cuba are going to be generational. I sincerely believe that the government will love Castro's sons or nephews to take over, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the Central Committee, like I said before, you have more than 90% is under 55 years old, and they have their own program.
Just quickly,
yeah,
Mr.
when you look at Cuba, you got to remember North Korea. Cuba is the reason Raul Castro is there because he's the brother of the dictator, and they want to stay in power indefinitely. The relationship with North Korea is very obvious. Just a couple of years ago, Cuba sent warplanes on a North Korean ship that was caught in the Panama Canal. It is not simply Raul Castro's demands. It's Raul Castro's actions that we have to take into account.
Yes, sir. You had a question? Right there.
Thank you for being here. I'm a Cuban American. I came when I was 7 years old, and I agree that the embargo has not worked. But are we naive enough to think that the Cuban government is going to allow the entrepreneur within the island to empower themselves? That's ridiculous. And sir, you said that people left their properties. I came when I was 7. My father was a doctor. They left everything, not by choice. So it's kind of sad to see that someone that fought in the Bay of Pigs invasion may come and said people just left their property there.
Let me, if I can address the part about the entrepreneurs. The Cubans, when I was there, Fidel traveled to China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Japan, and he came back and told the Central Committee of the Communist Party that he had seen tremendous economic development there, but they were making a mistake. They were going to eventually, if they kept allowing economic inequalities that come from economic growth, that they were going to lose political power. They were going to have demands for elections and internal elections in China. And he came back and said, we are not going to allow that. And he passed a law that had at the end that they were going to penalize other illicit activities, and that's when they cracked down on the entrepreneurs. They know that if you keep the income as they've been successful at $20 a month, people resolviendo, scrounging for food every day, they're not going to be thinking about higher level things. And that's their goal, not to allow what we want to do to happen, because they don't want to give up political power. And they've said it. They said, read our lips, we're not doing it.
Mr. Herrera?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, whenever we talk about or ask the question, are we so naive to think that the Cubans are going to all of a sudden do the right thing? No one's that naive. No one's even making that argument. It's how do you change the game so that you're forcing them to actually open up or to take steps in the right direction, right? So we know that the name of the game for the Cubans is control. They're more concerned about staying in power than anything else. But to be able to do that in the 21st century, they need to open up their economy to some degree because they can no longer depend on one sugar daddy, as was mentioned earlier, the way they did in previous decades or up until now with Venezuela. Even now, they've been pivoting away from that model to trading with the rest of the world. They've opened up and allowed entrepreneurs to start their own businesses because they can no longer keep them in the state payroll. So now, right now, you have over 470,000 licensed entrepreneurs operating in Cuba. They're making, I mean, compared to what folks here make here, it's a pittance. But for a lot of them, this has been life-changing. It's been very empowering. And I don't know a single entrepreneur who is satisfied with their lot and with all the heavy-handed restrictions that they have to deal with in Cuba. Entrepreneurs there are like entrepreneurs here. They want to grow their businesses and they want to fight the government to get rid of unnecessary regulations so that they can expand. And that's what entrepreneurs are doing in the island today. So we should be, the question is, are they going to let them? They don't have a choice. And in that opening, we should be doing everything we can to help those entrepreneurs and empower them.
We have one last question then from over here. And this will have to be our last question. This will have to be our last question.
Charles Ray is an attorney in South Florida. I represent many business owners. How many business owners here would like to do services or sell products and services to Cuba and not get paid? Raise your hand. Not get paid. In terms of policy supporting a change in Cuba, you know, if the idea behind the policy change is that somehow we're going to motivate Cuba to the government to somehow become more open. I heard the phrase civil independence of the people rising up. How many years would it take? Would it take 5 years to see that change? Would it take 10? I mean, the irony is that we don't have to actually go back and we don't have to guess at this. All you got to look at is China or Vietnam. Last time I remember, we developed relationships with China in 1972. And today, if you Google China freedom, political freedom, 2014, you have reports about ruthlessness by the government against people that stand up against the Chinese government. So ultimately, the question is, if you think it's going to change it, and I know there's a generational change, but I think your generation is the one that has to decide whether the older generation actually knows what they're talking about and it's truth that they're conveying, or there's meat and bones and real meat to the policy, or there's not. Other than the schooling, being trained about changing the policy, what had the Obama pronounced that would change Cuba so that we have a freedom and liberty and democracy? Because ultimately, any policy in this country should be driven by a principle. Do we believe in freedom and liberty or not? That's the issue. That's the question.
And how does your generation respond to that?
My generation is, look, there's plenty of people in your generation and Frank's generation that agree with us because they realize that after 50 years of trying the same thing, we should try something new. Because it hasn't worked.
And it's not
simple.
new. And it's not new.
Let me finish, if I may. As far as the China and Vietnam example, it's a very convenient one because we have two communist countries with market economies. But those cultures could not be more different from Cuban culture, okay? The Chinese value the greater harmony far more than individual rights as a culture. You'll be hard-pressed to find a more individualistic culture than the Cuban one, okay? There's a reason why the Chinese model hasn't been tried and hasn't succeeded anywhere else other than in Asia, okay? So thinking that Cuba is going to turn into China or Vietnam is not really based on much. We had dissidents just this week testifying in Congress, Rosa Maria Payá and Manuel Cuesta Morúa, both of whom said, we're not the Chinese, we're not Vietnam. Cuesta Morúa said that the Cuban government cannot survive the same sort of opening that China could survive. So again, we need to be a little more cognizant about the differences between those countries and these, because there are many other transitions from communism to capitalist countries or from totalitarian regimes to democracies that did work and did benefit from greater engagement. As far as when the change is going to come, no one. This again is the Poland. Look at the whole Eastern Bloc. A lot of the former Soviet countries. Again, thinking about that, we can put a timetable to this, goes back to the whole mind frame of trying to micromanage this from outside as opposed to trying to empower the people in the ground. And that's what this policy is. You're talking about freedom. This policy is about getting the governments out of the way and empowering individuals to become the agents of change. I'm sorry if you don't believe that, but it is what it's about.
All right, Mr. Calzón, I'll give you the last word very briefly,
Yes,
please.
the problem is that the president's policy is empowering the Cuban government. That's where the money is going. It's not going to the Cuban people. Now, as far as Poland and all those places, the U.S. government has been trying to do that by sending radios, by sending laptops, by helping the dissidents. And I know friends from China. I'm a human rights activist, and the idea that the Chinese really don't care about freedom, I think it's unfair to the Chinese people.
I didn't say that they don't care about freedom. I think that as a culture, the greater harmony supersedes.
We'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. I'm sorry. Please join me in thanking this very distinguished and lively panel.
On the next Washington Journal, reporter Anna Maria Andre